Hello, everyone. It's 1 o'clock Central Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Tricia Baker. I'm Executive Director of Human Resources for the General Counsel on Finance and Administration. I have with me today Sianta Hogan. She's our Human Resources Manager. She's going to be assisting me with the questions as we go through our training today. I would like to say we're going to go through several different topics before we get to the updates from the Department of Labor. We're going to do a brief overview of the Fair Labor Standards Act as it has been in place. We've gotten a lot of questions about who has to comply with the law. Before we consider the things that are changing, there are some very basic things that we need to talk through. This may be a refresher for some of you if you have HR backgrounds, but we're going to briefly go through that and talk about the law as it stands, and then the changes that are taking place, and then considerations for our ministry as we move forward and next steps. I do want to start by saying, although we make every effort to have a comprehensive presentation for you, we do not give legal advice. The issues that arise from wage and hour issues on the federal level and also on the state level are very complex. So if you have an issue or a specific concern that's not addressed today, we do encourage you to seek employment attorney advice or legal counsel, because again, there are many factors related to wage and hour issues on the federal and the state level. So regarding the Fair Labor Standards Act, this is the federal wage and hour law that is in place. And again, we're going through the law that has been in place. None of this is new information. This is what has been happening. So the Fair Labor Standards Act has four main components. They state that most employees in the United States must be paid at least a federal minimum wage. Currently, that is $7.25 per hour. Now, some states may have higher minimum wage values, and you do need to comply with your state laws and pay the higher wage if you do have one of those. But if your state does not have a minimum wage, then the federal minimum wage would apply to you and your employees. And then it also states that many employees have to be paid an overtime rate, which is time and a half for any hours worked over 40 in a work week. So that is the second component, main component of the Fair Labor Standards Act. They also give requirements for record keeping. For non-exempt or hourly staff members, you do have to keep specific information on your employees related to the hours that they've worked, their timesheets, things like that. So if you don't know that you are keeping all of that information, that would be a good thing to check into. There are, I believe, 19 different factors that you have to keep. If you have an online payroll system or human resources information system, you likely are already keeping track of this information, but it would be good just to do a refresher and ensure that you are keeping track appropriately. The fourth main provision relates to child labor laws. We're not going to go into those today because they're robust and complex and not really related to our ministry. So as it relates to the Fair Labor Standards Act, again, this is currently in place. This is nothing new. There are two different tests that can determine if employees are protected under the FLSA. The first test is what's called enterprise coverage. So that's going to look at an organization as a whole and determine if the employees of that organization have to or would be protected under the Fair Labor Standards Act and have to be paid time and a half, overtime, things like that. So that's really for organizations that have an annual dollar volume of sales of $500,000. So again, this is revenue, this is sales. This is not going to pertain to a lot of our organizations as we are a nonprofit, and it doesn't relate to charitable donations or donations from congregants. So this is really larger organizations who are for profit or do sales. And then any hospitals, nursing homes, schools, preschools, government agencies are also included in this provision. So there is a second test. So if your employees don't fall under enterprise coverage, you may still have to comply with the FLSA on an individual level. And what they have said is that employees are protected under the Fair Labor Standards Act if their work regularly involves them in interstate commerce. And that sounds like a very grand term, but it is very broad. And actually, most employees would fall under the FLSA under this test because interstate commerce, the Department of Labor has said, could involve anything from opening mail from other states, making calls across state lines, traveling across state lines for work-related activities, again, sending or receiving emails from individuals in other states. Zoom calls or conversations with individuals in other states could potentially be considered interstate commerce. And so if they're ordering items from other states, which most people do, most organizations do, you really would be hard pressed to find an employee that is not in some way engaging in interstate commerce very regularly. So that being said, if you feel as though, again, if you feel like there's an employee that you do not have to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act with, I would encourage you to seek an employment attorney or have that conversation because you might be missing some components. You just really want to make sure that you're compliant in that regard. Also, state regulations, if they don't fall under the FLSA, your state may have more strict wage and hour laws, so you may have to comply with those if they don't fall under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So some things to consider there. So again, we're talking about the current requirements for employees who are protected under the Fair Labor Standards Act. There are two specific categories of employees under the Act. Exempt employees are those that are not eligible for overtime pay. And that's where a lot of these changes we're going to discuss, the updates really come into play. But we use the term exempt in that they are exempt from overtime. They are not entitled to time and a half for any hours worked over 40 hours in a work week. Your non-exempt or hourly employees are those that are eligible for overtime pay. And I want to note here, if you have hourly staff members, you must track their time on a daily basis. They should be keeping thorough and accurate records of the time that they worked and on a daily basis and also on a weekly basis. And they must be paid time and a half for any hours worked over 40 hours in a work week. We have gotten some questions throughout our work here that, does it count if it's in a pay period, if they go over 40 in a pay period, can we roll over some to next week? No, the answer is within the work week, if an individual is an hourly staff member, if they work over 40 hours, they need to be paid time and a half for any hours worked over 40 in a work week. And you should have a designated work week that's communicated to all staff members. You can't change it based on, if it's annual conference or a busy season. Your work week should be set and communicated. So for example, it could be 12 a.m. on Monday until 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. And that is how you set your work week for determining overtime pay. Now, when it comes to overtime, we're talking about hours worked, hours that they have to give the employer. So that would not include things like vacation, sick time, PTO, unless you have some state law that you have to comply with. Under the federal law, any paid time that is not worked, so again, holiday, vacation, sick, that does not count towards that overtime calculation. So your timekeeping system or payroll system should be able to show overtime pay is calculated for hours worked, and then this extra paid time off that is not worked does not count toward that calculation. And again, you're looking at your work week. What are compensable work hours? That's hours that the employee is required to give to you as an employer. So if you have, for example, a receptionist who is sitting at your front desk and they're waiting to take calls or they're waiting to let someone in, but they're not actively working, they're still required to be there to give you your time. So those would still be hours worked because they are available to you. If an employee in this remote environment is working at home and checking emails or taking calls, that's hours worked. So any hours that they perform, even if it's not approved in advance, if they are working, then they still have to be paid for that time. So we can go really deep into what that means, especially in this telecommuting virtual world that we're in right now. But again, any hourly staff member has to track their time, and that includes all hours worked. So again, you have to be able to show the time records for your non-exempt or hourly staff. So you need to be able to show that you have complete and accurate records of their time worked. And there's really no set way that you have to do that. You can do it if you're using a timekeeping system like Paychex or ADP, and you're having the employee go in and punch online, that's fine. That's going to give you a very accurate record of their time worked. If you still use paper pay sheets and time cards, that's perfectly fine. As long as the employee is logging their daily hours in and out times, as well as the total weekly hours worked. As long as you're making, every effort to make sure those are accurate and complete, then that will work. What you want to make sure is that employees are trained to know that they need to write down the times that they are in and out. If you have a timesheet that says 8 a.m. every single day for 2 weeks, if there were to be a review of your time cards, that may cause some questions because employees come in at 8:03 or 7:55. No one shows up exactly at 8 every day. So you just want to make sure that your time records are, again, reflecting the actual time worked and they are as accurate and complete as possible. So that comes back to your methods and your training for employees and for managers to make sure that they know what they are responsible for. And then the FLSA does require specific time or record keeping requirements. So you have to keep your payroll records for at least 3 years. That includes paycheck stubs, any sort of employee related record related to pay, and time cards must be kept for 2 years. And that's important because if you were to have some sort of audit or charge from the Department of Labor as it relates to pay and wage and hour issues, you could potentially be liable for up to 2 to 3 years of back pay if there is an issue and they do find some sort of concern. So you really want to make sure, again, you're keeping those records and you're keeping them for the required amount of time. So we've talked about hourly or non-exempt staff members and how you have to keep record of their time. For an employee to be considered exempt, they have to meet 3 specific tests. Each of these tests have to be met. You can't just do one of these and then an employee not be eligible for overtime. All 3 of these have to be met. The first is the job duties test that we'll talk about when you look at the individual's role and their responsibilities, how they are paid, if they are paid on a salaried basis. And then the third test is how much they are paid. So again, they have to meet all 3, but they have to have a minimum salary per week in order to not be eligible for overtime. And that's where we're going to talk about the updates from the Department of Labor, and that's where that really comes into play. So when it comes to the job duties test, you're looking at the position. You're not looking at the job title or the individual in the role and what knowledge and skills and abilities they bring to the table. You're looking at the duties of the job. The first most general exemption is the executive exemption. And this is pretty straightforward. It's an individual who manages either the organization or a department or a subset of the organization. And they are regularly involved with the directing of at least 2 employees' work. So they manage 2 employees and they are regularly involved in directing those full-time employees' work. And they should have decision-making or say in any employment decisions for the employees that they manage. So do you take their recommendations on hiring or terminations or promotions or pay increases? Does their opinion in those matters really have weight in the decision-making? Do they have a voice? And so if all 3 of these criteria are met, all 3, then they would meet the executive exemption and under the job duties test. The second job duties test that's most common is the administrative exemption. And again, this doesn't go back to job title. An individual's job title really doesn't have any say in it. So if they are an administrative assistant, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would be exempt under the job duties test. Their primary duty under this exemption would be that they perform office or non-manual work that is directly related to the management or the business operations of the employer. And then also their primary duties include the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respects to matters of significance. So are they making business decisions? Can they make decisions on their own without having to consult with their manager? In most cases, we're all going to have situations where we may need to talk to our manager or our bishop about decisions. But in general day-to-day work, do they have independent decision-making authority? And if those two criteria are met, then they could be considered exempt under the administrative test. So some examples of positions that may fall under this exemption would be accountants who are actually doing accounting work, not necessarily just processing documentation, but are they making accounting related decisions? Higher level finance employees, human resources individuals who provide guidance or consult with staff and managers, benefits individuals who may make decisions on the benefit plans, or any other matters related to benefits or pension with your organization, higher level computer employees, networking, things like that. So again, you really want to look at the job description and the job duties of the individual to see if they meet the criteria for this test. Third is the professional exemption, and I just wanted to define this a little bit broader because it says professional, but that's not anyone that's just in a professional role. It really is individuals who are in a role that requires advanced knowledge in a specific field. So it's going to be things like doctors and lawyers who are really narrowed in terms of their professional career and their scope of knowledge and what they bring. So typically the professional exemption, again, is going to be attorneys and physicians, things like that. Two other kinds of exemptions are the computer-related exemptions. So not necessarily your help desk employees, but individuals who are involved in the design and development of computer systems and systems analysis. So software developers, things like that, they would meet the criteria for computer employee exemptions potentially. And then outside sales, we hear about that a lot. We really probably wouldn't have anyone that meets that exemption, but that's individuals whose primary duty takes them outside of the organization, building relationships and making sales contacts, and they're engaged away from the office. So these are the 5 most common exemptions or job duties tests that you would see. I just wanted, again, to go through those. So as we go through these, we will have a time for questions and answers at the end. I just want to make sure everyone knows that. So I may answer your question in what we go through, or at the end, if you have additional questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we will answer those. So the second test, so we've talked about the job duties test. The second test is the salary basis test. So how are they paid? For an individual to be exempt, they have to be paid on a salary basis for a set amount of dollars per week. They don't have to be paid necessarily on a weekly basis, but they have to be told you will make X number of dollars per week. And then you cannot deduct from that pay unless it's for a qualified reason. You couldn't deduct from their weekly salary if they took a few hours off. You can't deduct from their pay because of the quality of their work. They're guaranteed their weekly salary unless they miss a whole day of work, and we'll talk about that next. So again, you would communicate that salary to them at the beginning and that they are exempt staff and they would be paid on a salary basis. So a salary basis means that you cannot deduct from their pay, again, because of the hours that they worked. Now, if they are gone for an entire day, you may have PTO that supplements their salary, and that's perfectly fine if you have a vacation or PTO or sick time policy that would supplement their pay. But in terms of not paying them for an entire day, you would have to make sure you're following the guidelines of the Department of Labor. So if they have an entire day absence, that you have a bona fide absence or policy or practice related to deducting from their pay, then you could deduct from their salary. So for example, if someone goes out on a leave of absence and your policy is to apply pay time away until they've exhausted all of their time, for a salaried staff member, you could apply vacation, PTO in whole day increments. And then once they have exhausted all of their paid time, you could deduct from their salary or not pay them for entire day increments. So a best practice there is having a policy that if exempt staff have exhausted paid leave, such absences or unpaid absences would be in whole day increments. So again, just something to consider, nothing new, but when you're looking at your policies and procedures, that's something to consider. So you have someone who meets the job duties test and they're paid on a salaried basis. This is where the changes from the Department of Labor are coming into play. Because right now, the minimum salary that you would have to pay someone to meet the third test, the salary basis test, is $684 per week. That equates to about $35,500 or $600 per year. That is increasing. So as of July 1, the first increase is taking place. July 1, 2024, that is increasing to $844 per week. The second increase will be taking place January 1, 2025, and that will increase the minimum salary to $1,128 per week, which is about $58,000. So these are significant increases. Why did the Department of Labor do this? Well, they have not increased the minimum salary in some time, and they really evaluated what workers are making, and they looked at the lowest earning region of the United States, which from a census standpoint is the South, and they looked at the 35th percentile of those salaried earners, and that's where they got this minimum salary threshold. So these will increase in these two phases, and then they have built into the new update that they would be looking at this every 3 years thereafter. I know some of you may be aware that this did occur in 2016. They tried to increase the minimum salary value and it was blocked. They gave a large waiting period for that. I believe it was 4 or 5 months before it went into effect. And so it was blocked by a federal judge. They only gave about 60 days notice for this phase of the increases. So you should probably go ahead and plan that this will occur. There may be some legal challenges, but this will probably take place on July 1. So just something to consider there. So what does that mean? If you currently have, let's use a staff accountant, for example. They meet the job duties test and they are paid on a salaried basis and they make $45,000 per year. They can be exempt from overtime and do not have to receive overtime pay during that first increase. But if they are not making at least $58,656 per year as of January 1, they are entitled to overtime. And this is just related to positions who are in a lay role or administrative role. We'll talk about the ministerial exception a little later on. This is related to your staff members who are doing administrative work, maybe janitorial work, individuals who are not in the ministry type position. So if you are currently paying them on a salary basis, for them not to be eligible for overtime, they have to be making this salary per week. There is a provision that you can make up some of this up to 10% of the salary with non-discretionary bonuses, something that you promise someone by the end of the calendar year, you're guaranteed to receive this bonus. We don't really do bonuses in the religious nonprofit world. So that may not pertain to you, but that is something that has come up and that the Department of Labor has said that you can do up to 10% of that in a non-discretionary bonus. But in general, you're probably going to pay your employees on a salary basis, and for them to not receive overtime, they would need to make at least that minimum salary threshold. So anyone who is making under that amount will have to track their hours on a daily and weekly basis and would be entitled to overtime if they worked over 40 hours in a work week. So some things to consider when it comes to the ministry. The ministerial exception is something that would pertain to individuals who are working in a ministry role. So for example, the easiest example would be clergy that are pastors at a local church. Lead pastor, associate pastor, they are pastors. That is the definition of someone who's in a ministerial role. So a pretty good justification there that they would meet the ministerial exception. If they meet the ministerial exception, the Department of Labor has said that they are not under essentially the control of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and they can be paid on a salary basis that is below that salary threshold. So they would not be subject to the requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, that being said, that's from a technical standpoint. You still want to consider your pay practices, your pay equity practices, looking at your employees kind of on a whole, on a bigger picture. Are you paying them a fair wage? Are you paying them equitably if they are in different, employment related categories or different demographics? So that can go, again, way more specific in terms of your own compensation philosophy at your organization. But in general, if someone meets the ministerial exception, they do not have to be paid the salary minimum, and they would not be entitled to overtime under the FLSA protection. This is really an individual analysis. There's really no checklist from the Department of Labor on what would be considered the ministerial exception. You really have to analyze the role and determine a variety of factors if they are really involved in conveying their role in conveying the message and the mission of the organization. So they don't necessarily have to be ordained clergy. It really looks at their individual role and how they fit into the organization. So that would be an individual analysis of each position. So we couldn't say today, yes, this role would be a ministerial exception. That one would not be. If it goes beyond, the further you get from a pastor at a local church, the more you really need to consider analysis and consider reaching out to an employment attorney to make sure that you are, documenting appropriately that someone is meeting that ministerial exception, and really analyze the position. So when it comes to, if you do determine that someone is under the ministerial exception, that's something that you would need to document in their job description, or maybe keep that documentation in their payroll file that you have analyzed the position, and that's what your determination is, that they are under the ministerial exception. We'll talk a little bit about job descriptions later on, but it really is essential to analyze the duties that the position performs, so that you can show, that you have analyzed the position. This is truly what they do, and this is how you got to that conclusion. So again, if they are in a ministerial role and they are determined to have that exception, you would not have to pay them the minimum salary threshold or overtime. So just something to consider there. I wanted to briefly talk about camps, because many of our annual conferences have operating camps that operate in different ways, a different number of camps in different states. I just want to say one more time, in the ministerial exception, when you're considering that, there may be state laws that come into play there. I know I say that a lot, but it really does vary from state to state. So just remember, when you're doing any sort of analysis with jobs and wage and hour, to consider any state laws that may come into play. But with camps, there are, in general, camps do have to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act, paying overtime and paying the exempt staff that minimum salary threshold. They may be exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act if they meet one of two tests. They do not operate for more than 7 months in a calendar year, or if they look at the preceding year, if they look at their 6 busiest months and 6 not busiest months, and they compare the average receipts from those two groups, do the lower performing months, are they not more than 33.3% of the average receipts from the busiest 6 months? They don't have to be concurrent. It can be, maybe December is your busiest month because you have a lot of Christmas camps. So you could look at the summer months in December and maybe January. It's just the busiest months in terms of numbers. So that's a way that you can analyze if the camp would be subject to the FLSA. One thing I do want to say is that you really need to consider, if you are thinking that your camp is exempt from the FLSA, there are some criteria also related to how they operate, in terms of if they operate under the Federal Employee Identification Number, or FEIN, of the conference. They may be considered a component of the conference, and it may be considered one big organization. It really depends on record keeping, how much the operations overlap. So you really need to do an analysis of that. We have some camps who have reached out to an employment attorney and gotten consultation to determine if they did have to comply. Highly recommend that if you're really going down that road, but there is some overlap there. And then to consider the receipts test, You have to do that every year. So every year you have to look at the preceding year and see if you still meet that criteria. And if that changes, then you would have to start complying with the Fair Labor Standards Act. So again, make sure you're looking at state laws. If you are going to consider a ministerial exception for someone at the camps, again, make sure you're doing an analysis of their job duties to see if they do need to be paid overtime or the salary minimum. We're going to be sending out an FAQ document after this with some of the questions that will come up in the conversation and some things that we have seen come through a lot to us in email. We're also going to have links to some of the fact sheets from the Department of Labor because they have a lot of really good information. One of those is listed here. It's the exemption for seasonal amusement recreational establishments. It's a fact sheet that lists out all of the information, and it really is a good resource. So what does this mean for next steps? So you really want to make sure that you have up-to-date job descriptions for your individuals in their roles, and make sure that you're really defining their current duties and what they are doing day to day, week to week, month to month. Look at your current wage and hour policies and procedures. So you want to make sure you have policies that you intend to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act, or that you comply with state and federal law, that your hourly employees will be paid for all hours worked. Make sure that you are training your staff so that they know what's expected of them from an employee standpoint and a manager standpoint. Consider your practices in terms of timekeeping. Are you making sure that your employees are giving you the most accurate and complete hours that they're working? Do they know they're not supposed to work off the clock if they are hourly? Are they submitting their timesheets? Are managers approving timesheets from employees? That's a good practice and highly recommended because, a manager may know, oh, this employee left this time off, or I know that employee was working because I was receiving emails from them at 8 o'clock at night. So I need them to go in and add those hours. Just having that second set of eyes on timesheets from a managerial perspective is a really good practice. Highly recommended there. And again, make sure that your employees who are salaried or exempt from overtime, that they really do meet those job duties tests that we talked about, and that they are meeting all of the components under those job duties tests, not just sometimes, but primarily they are meeting all of the components under the job duties test that you feel that they fall under, and then document that in the job description. Are they exempt or non-exempt? So you can show, you are reviewing that information and the employee knows if they are eligible for overtime or not. If an employee is under the salary threshold as of those effective dates, they would be considered non-exempt and would have to be paid overtime. One thing that has come up, and you may have heard in conversation, is can someone be non-exempt and salaried? And the answer is yes. If they don't meet that salary threshold, they're still entitled to overtime, but you can pay an employee on a salaried basis, but they still have to track their hours for the purpose of reporting overtime. And they still have to make essentially the minimum wage for the federal requirement and the state requirements. So you can consider someone salaried non-exempt, but again, they still are entitled to overtime. So they track their hours in the same manner, but you don't have to vary their pay unless they get to over 40 hours in a work week. And then you would use your time and a half calculation based on their regular hourly rate of pay. So something to consider there. And if you have employees who you just cannot get to that minimum salary threshold, they're currently exempt and they're going to have to go to non-exempt, make sure they're trained on how to keep records of their time before that effective date takes place, and make sure you communicate to them what is taking place. Decide who's going to have that conversation and decide how that will be communicated to the employee. Because this really is a regulations change. It may not necessarily change how they do their work or their role. It's not a demotion. It's simply a procedural change in terms of keeping you compliant with federal wage and hour laws. And consider, do you have different PTO plans for your exempt and non-exempt staff? Is there going to be an impact there? Is that something that you need to consider and then also communicate? Because you, again, want to make sure you're staying in line with your current policies and procedures. And there may be a morale concern. If you have two staff accountants who currently are exempt and then you're going to have to make one of them non-exempt because they don't meet the salary threshold. And maybe one's been there 20 years and one's been there 1 year, and they are just paid at different rates. Really consider how that's going to impact the department. Do you want to make them a salaried non-exempt position? How do you want to communicate to that employee that they have to switch to now being hourly? And consider how that may be perceived by the employees. So just some things there to really plan out before you get to that July 1 or the January 1 date. And again, you want to make sure your staff and your managers are trained. So your staff should know what's expected of them in terms of timekeeping and in terms of what is hours worked. They're not expected to work off the clock. Does overtime have to be paid, to be approved in advance? And if it does, then how do they get that approval? If you do have a policy that an employee has to receive overtime approval in advance, that may be the case, but if they work unapproved overtime, you still have to pay them for that time worked. Now you can address the approval issue and have that conversation, but if you know an employee has worked, you have to pay them for that time, and you have to pay them time and a half if it's overtime. So just a good rule of thumb, something to consider. And then communicate any break requirements that may be as a result of a change. For example, so the Fair Labor Standards Act from a federal standpoint doesn't really determine break times for employees. They don't have a law that employees have to get a break, but a lot of states do. For example, in Tennessee, if an hourly non-exempt staff member works at least 6 hours in a day, they are entitled to a 30-minute break where they clock out, they're off the clock, and they can take their break and rest. And that's the minimum. So maybe as an exempt employee, they didn't necessarily have that specific time that they had to take for lunch. Maybe they were just used to working through lunch. But now as an hourly staff member, you have to give them that break, and they have to take it. They have to step away and not work and take that break and take that rest time because they're entitled to it from a state standpoint. Now, some states may say, you can offer it to the employee and they can choose to not take it, but that may be the case in some states, but you really want to look at those regulations and make sure that you're doing what you need to do. I did say that the Fair Labor Standards Act does not require breaks, and it does not. But one thing that comes up quite a bit is they state what can be considered a true break. So if you have an hourly staff member who is clocking out for lunch, but they only clock out for 15 minutes, the Department of Labor doesn't really think that that's enough time to take a true break, and they consider that time that should be paid. So really, if you're going to have a true meal break where an employee's clocking out, in order for it to be unpaid, it needs to be at least 20 minutes. If it's less than that, then the Department of Labor thinks that that's not enough time for a true break, and they would consider that paid time. So just something to consider. And these are all new things. Again, these are things that probably are already in your policy, but you're going to have to really convey to any impacted employees who are going from exempt to non-exempt. So just something to consider there. And again, there may be some follow-up that may be needed as employees shift to using time cards and getting out of that exempt mentality. You may have to follow up with them to remind them to clock in and out and get them used to doing that. But you're ensuring that they are receiving the protections that they are entitled to by asking them to clock in and out and getting them paid for all the hours that they are entitled to. Because again, they are entitled to the overtime protections based on the rate that they are paid. So again, another thing to consider. That brings us to the end of the presentation. I'm going to go into the class, see several questions. So let me go ahead and open that up. And then
Tricia, a lot of questions that we are getting are around how housing allowance plays into compensation for this. So if you will address that, that'll
yes,
cover quite a
thank
few.
you. That is a very good question. So housing allowances, if they are paid on a paycheck, if they are part of the compensation package and they receive the pay and it's just from a tax consideration or from a position consideration, if it is paid to the employee on their normal regular pay basis, then it can be considered part of the salary. If it's provided to them like a parsonage or a housing campsite, then it would not be considered as part of the salary threshold. And that's something we checked into. One of the first questions we asked when this came up. But if it is paid to the employee as a housing allowance on their paycheck, then it can be considered as part of that salary threshold test. But again, providing housing or utilities, if you give them housing or utilities, then it would not be considered as the salary threshold. And I will.
And then there was another kind of a few questions asking about the lawsuits and the potential for the delay of these salary increases. Do you have any thoughts on that that you would like to share? And how they should move forward?
I would say first, if you really have to delay, I would consult an employment attorney so you have that guidance. But I will say, if you don't meet the salary threshold test and you treat someone as if they're exempt and they are not meeting all three of those criteria, then if you were to receive a charge or an audit, the Department of Labor would say they are not truly exempt. They were entitled to overtime. If that were the case, if they were to come in, they will interview employees to see what hours they worked. Really the burden of proof on stating that the employee worked X number of hours is on the employer. So it really would be a matter of, are they owed back pay for the overtime that they worked during the period where they were incorrectly classified? And if you're intentionally doing that, if you know they don't meet the criteria, but you're still treating them as if they're not eligible for overtime, it could be really problematic in terms of back pay penalties, things like that. And if you get to this point and maybe you're thinking some issues are coming up and you're realizing some things, if you were to have a charge or an audit, they could potentially go back 2 or 3 years to determine what overtime the employee was entitled to if they were incorrectly categorized. So just some general things to consider. It could be very problematic. But again, if you're sitting here thinking, oh, I've really got to reconsider some things, or you have some red flags that are coming up in terms of practices, I would definitely recommend reaching out to an employment attorney in your state. So one of the questions I see right now is church preschool teachers. How should they be treated if they are 20 hours per week, 9 months of the year? Do they fall under the ministerial exception or exemption? I'm going to say, if you would have asked me a year ago if church preschool teachers had to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act, I would say they probably do, and you need to pay them time and a half for overtime and track their hours and treat them as a typical hourly non-exempt employees. The Department of Labor has released a letter on their opinion. In the letter, they did not say that they would consider preschool teachers at a religious organization as a ministerial exception. They said the organization has to do an individual analysis. And if you determine that they meet the ministerial exception, then you do not have to, they would not have to comply with the FLSA. So I would say it's, again, back to that ministerial exception. It's really based on what they're doing, how much time they're spending in the ministry, how much, if they're changing diapers and they're giving bottles to children, I would say they fall under the FLSA, and you would need to track their time and at least pay them over or minimum wage and pay them for every hour worked. But again, it's an individual analysis, and it's going to vary by state. Camping staff, I see another question about camping staff who are provided with camp housing. Again, that would not count towards the salary threshold. When it comes to leaders who are taking students on mission trips, they are overseeing them the entire time. If they fall under the ministerial exception, and you feel they're ministers in that sense, then you would just be able to pay them their salary. If they are not salaried and they are hourly, then you really want to evaluate what's work hours and what's not, and consider, is it more cost effective to consider their role and consider their job duties, and would they be better off being exempt, and are they exempt, or would you need to pay them the overtime that would be required on these trips? If you were to take an hourly staff member, let's say you have an hourly staff member who is going to general conference, just happened. We had, several hourly staff members who were there. In general, if you have an hourly staff member who's traveling, a best practice is to start paying them when they start traveling. If it's outside their normal commute time, you would pay them for any hours they're required to be present. If they're working a booth, if they are, engaging in a meal, but they are still working, they have to be at a meal, it would be hours worked. And then if they are able to do whatever they want, go back to their hotel room, mentally decompress, go on to dinner on their own, be on their own time, then typically that would be unpaid time. That goes back to your policies and procedures, but generally, if someone's on a trip, they still have to log the hours of what they're required to give the employer in terms of calculating hours worked. So again, just a consideration there, because we do have, it's annual conference season and we will have jurisdictional conference. So just some things to consider there. Let's see. Sianta, I don't know if you have any that you would like to.
There's a lot of questions concerning, and I don't know if you want to kind of retouch on this, having part-time employees that are salaried, and then the difference between non-exempt and hourly, and how we're how those can be viewed interchangeably. So I don't know if
Yeah.
you want to offer any clarity in those areas.
So if you have a part-time staff member that is, you feel they are exempt and exempt salaried, not entitled to overtime, that salary threshold is not prorated. You can say they're 20 hours and they're part-time salaried and they're responsible for working about 20 hours a week, but they still have to make that 43,000 and then that 58,000. That's not prorated. If you are going to not give them overtime, then you have to pay them at least that amount per week, and it's not prorated. Now, you can have a part-time salaried non-exempt person who you say you work 25 hours a week and your salary is this, but they still have to track their hours because they're non-exempt. They would get paid based on 25 hours of work as long as it's more than the minimum wage and you've communicated that to them. But they still have to track their time, because if something happens and they end up working over 40 hours, you're making your effort to say, okay, for this week you get time and a half for your 2 hours of overtime. So again, you can say part-time salaried, but they still have to meet these tests. And then again, if they are non-exempt, they don't meet the salary threshold, then they would have to be entitled to overtime. There was a question about FLSA guidance related to camps. We talked about that, but I also want to say, I know that the camping board sent out a white paper to the camp leaders, and it is robust and it has a lot of great information in it. So if you have received that, take the time. If you're a camp director and you want to share it with your treasurer, I really would encourage you to read through that, because it has a lot of more specific information that we could not get to today about camps. And I feel as though it would be a really good tool for a lot of leaders.
And then there was a few questions about PTO being required. And I don't believe the FLSA mandates that, but there may be federal requirements for.
Can you repeat that one more time? Can you say that?
Is the PTO policy required? If someone is a part-time employee, are they required to have vacation and all?
Oh, I see.
Those?
So the FLSA does not require vacation or sick time for anyone. And that's on an employer. Now, there are state laws that do require certain types of leaves. But I will say, yes, that depends on state law and then your policies as to if you want to, give it to part-time employees, and define what part-time employees are. Are you saying that employees 30 hours or more are full-time and those 29 hours or less, are part-time, and then what they're eligible for? So that goes back to your practices, your policies, following those, and then saying, based on state law, our policies, here's what we offer, and make that clear. One of the questions I see, and this is a valid question, is there official rationale as to why those who are under the ministerial exception are not entitled to fair and equitable pay? I would say they are entitled to fair and equitable pay in terms of as a whole, as a connection on a conference level. You should be evaluating if you're paying your ministers a fair and equitable wage. But in terms of this specific federal law, it goes back to the First Amendment and freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the religious organizations and how they can pay employees. And it goes back to that argument. So it's not really you can pay them whatever you want. You still need to pay them a fair and equitable wage. But in terms of these specific federal tests, that is what the Department of Labor has said, we are not going to tell you how to pay your ministers, essentially, is the general tone of the letter that came out on that. So can an employee under the threshold choose flex time? Can they work 48 hours one week and then take a day off the following week. No, they have to be, if they work in a work week, and this is, again, they're very straightforward on this. If they are non-exempt and they work 48 hours in a work week, working all 48 hours, they are eligible for 40 hours of straight regular pay and 8 hours of time and a half. It can't be flexed into the next week. It has to be paid. And that's on, if you have your posters up to date, there's a Fair Labor Standards Act poster, a federal poster that's required. It's on there. It's on their website. They are very straightforward about that. If they are eligible for overtime, they have to be paid overtime. You can't do any other method. I did see one question about a flexible work week or a changing of your work week. I'm going to say, in general, you have to have a set work week because it would kind of come off as you're trying to get out of paying the employee overtime if you're changing your work week. But if you do want to consider a flexible work week, or you have been doing that, I really think you need the consultation of an employment attorney, just because our recommendation is going to be it's set and you don't change it. Again, you don't want to look like you're trying to get out of paying someone overtime by changing up the work weeks. I would say, I'm seeing, Sianta, do you see any that have not been answered? I would say if you have questions about if certain positions at your church fall under the ministerial exception, I would start with your conference office, because they may have other positions that they've recommended to treat the same way, or they may have, practices from other churches. I'm not sure if the individual conferences want to, discuss that with their staff or have some sort of consultation, but I'm seeing that come through. It's really an individual basis, though, and looking at the individual position. So it's not something that, GCFA can say, yes, all of these positions fall under the ministerial exception. Unless it's a local pastor, an actual pastor role, I would say you really need to do that individual analysis. The local pastor is going to be the most straightforward, or the pastor at a local church is going to be the most straightforward position. And again, they don't have to be ordained clergy from a Department of Labor standard. They have said that it doesn't have to be ordained clergy. They're just operating in a ministerial role.
And we will send out the link for the white paper again, for the white paper for any of you all that are asking that as part of the meeting material. I see a lot of those questions that are coming in now for the links.
Yes.
They're also asking links for the camping information that was sent out, if there's a way for them to access that.
I don't know if we have a link to it. I know it came from the camping board, but I can see if we can reach out to them or get a link from their site. One of the questions, what about a director of music or organist who don't work full-time, but they meet the job duties test? If they meet the job duties test, they have to meet that salary threshold too in order to not receive overtime. So unless they meet the ministerial exception, there's so many ifs in each position. You really need to look at them on an individual basis, but it's not something where, oh, they played an organ. There is a creative exception, but that's really for people who create music and they create art or, music. It's not just, playing a hymn on a Sunday that's already written. So you can't really say because they play the organ, they're exempt. They would be treated as any other employee, really.
And then the questions about time clocking, tracking, whether there actually have to be punches, timestamps, or just logging, surrounding.
You can choose any method you want. The Department of Labor has said, as long as you can have a post-it that says 8:03 until 5:07, as long as the employee is writing down their time and they have a time record and they're giving that to you and saying, this is how I should be paid, then you're keeping their record. Again, you don't want an employee saying, I'm working 8 to 5 for the next 2 weeks, because that you don't know if they're working over. You don't know if they're working under. You need to make sure that they're tracking their actual time. So if they're traveling, it could be that they're writing it down. If you have a paychecks or an ADP, you can set it up to where they can go in and put in their time or punch remotely. It's really a matter of your own practices and kind of how you've been doing it, or if you have a way to improve it, that would be great too. So can you reduce the number of hours an employee works if you cannot raise them to the new rate on a 40-hour work week? That's a great question. Yes, you can look at their job duties and say, hey, I'm going to have to make you non-exempt. So we're going to have to keep your hours within 40, 40 hours. You're going to be entitled to overtime. So I'm going to take this off your plate. And that way you can stay, within 40, or really go in and evaluate your employees' work hours and what they're doing. And if they have to go to non-exempt, you may have to reconsider how the work is structured and what they're doing. And then, maybe reevaluate some job descriptions and rework kind of how you go forward, because you just may not be able to meet that salary threshold. And you really have to kind of live into, what does the work for someone who's used to working over going to look like if they're limited to a 40-hour work week, and really communicating to them that they cannot volunteer their time. If they are a paid employee, I cannot, out of the goodness of my heart, if I'm an hourly employee, work off the clock and donate that time to my organization. That is not, you cannot do that. If you're a paid employee, you have to be paid for all hours worked. And you are going to have employees who probably really want to do a good job, and they may try to, get in extra hours, but you really need to communicate to them. It is essential that they be paid what they're entitled to be paid, and they have that protection, and they need to log their hours. So it may be a shift for a lot of employees, but yes, you can rework how your processes work. Um, let's see. Is there recommended language for when salaried employees must use time off? Yes, I would say, you can, well, is there recommended verbiage? One, it depends on the state, but two, you can tell, our or exempt staff, if you work you can use your PTO in half-day increments. If you leave 2 hours early, you can just have a paid day, and then, you flex your work week. Exempt staff may have a more flexible work week because they work until the work gets done. They don't get that overtime protection. So in your policy, you should have, exempt staff can use their days off in whole day increments, half day increments, whereas, hourly staff members get to use it in 15-minute increments, as an example. So you can, you really want to look at your policies, and again, make sure that you're treating your exempt staff as exempt and your non-exempt staff as non-exempt. And it's a mentality shift, again, for supervisors too. Can an exempt employee for a summer camp switch back to non-exempt status during the winter? Yeah. If they meet the criteria for the job duties test, and they are meeting the salary threshold in the job duties test during the summer, but they're just not going to meet the salary threshold, maybe they're part-time through the winter, you can change their status as long as you are truly reflecting, what they're doing, and you're giving them overtime when they're entitled to it. Then yeah, you can change their status. Typically, one of the things we have 3 minutes, so I'm going to try to maybe take one more question. But one of the things the Department of Labor has said, that typically, like, cooks and housekeeping individuals are protected by the FLSA. So most of the time they're going to be hourly non-exempt staff in most circumstances. And so I know that it's hard to control hours at camps because things get crazy and you have weekend groups, but it's really something to consider. If they don't meet that job duties test and they're not making decisions, they would be non-exempt and they would be entitled to overtime. So is it more cost effective to hire a part-time person to come in and kind of take off some of that overtime off that employee? Or can you, move the work around? You really have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Sianta, do you see anything we can take for the last question? I see a lot of questions that are, do you have to meet the salary threshold and the duties test? Yes. All 3 tests: salary basis, job duties, and salary threshold, in order to be exempt from overtime. If you do not meet any of those 3, then you have to be non-exempt. You have to be entitled. You are entitled to overtime.
There's questions about resources when doing analysis on whether a position falls under each of the exceptions.
There's more, when we send out our FAQs, there are more resources that give more, the Department of Labor has given more guidance and more specific information about what those individual tests mean, and the definitions of some of those terms that may be ambiguous. So we can include that in our resources. And then if, you have any further questions, then we can take those. And then, someone asked about the link to sign up for the collaborator. That will go out with the follow-up email. Okay. Thank you all. I appreciate your time, and I hope you maybe learned something today. Thank you very much.